Spoilers throughout the latest episode, Season 4, Episode 16, but no manga spoilers. Beware the comments on YouTube. Attack on Titan is the largest flip I've ever experienced with a work of fiction. With the manga coming to an end this week, I thought it would be a good time to talk about my mixed initial impression of the series and give a brief rundown as to why my second viewing felt so powerful. If you're thinking to yourself, this show is fine, but it's not all that great, I think I know where you're coming from, because I recall thinking something similar on my first viewing. I'll start by establishing a baseline of my first time through the story. 2016. This man was president. I was a stressed-out college student who occasionally needed to vegetable out to Netflix to decompress from schoolwork. All I knew about Attack on Titan was that some kid at school wore a scout's cape everywhere. I was amused, and eventually checked out the show, but I didn't like it too much. I'll run through a few pros and cons quickly from what I thought from back then. The characters were grating or flat. Eren was irritating to the point of being insufferable, Mikasa had a decent early arc, but was flat from then on, and Armin was just okay. Levi had cool action scenes, but the rest of the cast didn't occupy much headspace for me. Dialogue was generally clunky, and too many verbose thoughts and flashbacks got on my nerves. The pacing was indeed all over the place. Everyone loves to talk about this one, and it's just accurate. There were so many spots in Season 1 that took way too much time. Armin standing in a spot for an entire episode, that sort of thing. Background mystery was reasonably intriguing, but I was afraid of a J.J. Abrams-style mystery box execution. I was afraid that I would yet invest in the story, only to be hit by some terrible execution, or non-execution, and just be left with nothing. I really like the thrilling LDM scenes, action sequences, music, and general feeling. Despite being mixed on the experience, I think I understood why it was so popular. The premise was psychological Play-Doh, and so easy to project your own problems onto, and pull for the heroes to defy stacked odds and near certain death. It's a real red meat foundation or premise to build a story on. I think the reverse power fantasy had an escapist appeal, similar to how people would love to talk about how they'd survive in a hypothetical zombie apocalypse back in the day. I have to imagine that's how it was for Cape Guy, some kind of LARPing fantasy of wearing a scout's cape. It seemed doomed to succeed in the cultural zeitgeist of the early to mid-2010s when stuff like The Walking Dead was at its peak. I just thought it had a lot of issues that stopped me from really enjoying it. I kept half-heartedly reading the manga because I was procrastinating on physics problem sets and not wanting to think about politics. And I enjoyed it more. The twists helped the plot pick up intensity, and the characters grew on me a little bit, but I still disliked Eren. The Armored and Colossal Titan reveal was unconventionally casual, which really worked for me. The following Uprising arc was actually my favorite at that time. Maybe I just like being a contrarian by saying that Attack on Titan is at its best when there are no titans. But really, the human versus human action scenes, guerrilla warfare, and political gambits made it feel a bit more like Game of Thrones back when saying that was a compliment. Next, the Shinganshina battle had some powerful stuff. Chiefly, Erwin's arc and his last stand felt impactful, but I probably would have struggled to explain why, and I couldn't decide if it was more disturbing or heroic. Then the basement reveal happened, and I can't quite remember exactly how surprised I was, because an outside world was heavily hinted at. It was just a question of whether Isayama would commit to the twist or not. But oh boy, he sure did. I was overwhelmed by the scene change and exposition in the Marley arc. I couldn't tell if it was brilliant, or if Isayama had just abandoned any sense of good storytelling he might have had by ditching our cast for almost a year in real time. That's where I fell off the monthly weight. Up to that point, it was maybe a 7 out of 10 experience that just didn't occupy too much headspace. 2020. Pandemic. Losing my mind alone in a small studio. I realized Season 3 had finished and gave the anime another shot. Maybe it was because I was paying full attention, or maybe it was because there really just is that much of the story that is recontextualized upon revisit, but I liked it so much more. It's not as if the flaws vanished. The dialogue is still ungraceful, but I found so much to appreciate in terms of narrative detail, thematic content, and world building. There were details and concepts I didn't even notice my first time that fundamentally changed the way I viewed the story or characters. Simply put, it was so much more thoughtful than I had initially given it credit for. I want to share a bit of this newfound appreciation with you, but because so much of the magic was from discovering this stuff organically, I'll try to strike a balance by looking at an example from each category of plot, theme, and world building to hopefully convey the thoughtfulness of the story, in the hopes that lukewarm viewers may discover the same appreciation through your own revisit. Let's start with a lovely instance of intricate plotting, but I need to justify this a little bit first. I'm not always a fan of overly complex plot mechanics. My go-to example is maybe the game, The Witcher 2. Without spoiling it, it's a large, sprawling spider web of political intrigue that takes 2 or 3 playthroughs to understand, and its geopolitics is so intricate that it's hard to follow the plot unless you're physically looking at a world map. To use a ridiculous analogy, intricate plotting in reasonable quantities is like those little bits of burnt cheese in Costco cheese pizza. But entire cheese pizza is kinda boring. Attack on Titan gets this balance right for me. It has its share of technical intricacies, but subjectively they are in good balance with other components that have provocative takeaways or grounded themes. Now then, let's talk about Season 2, Castle Siege, or What's in a Can of Herring. Let's recall the scene. The scouts had been investigating the alleged breach in Wall Rose after stopping by Ragoko village, found nothing, and chose to weather the night in a nearby abandoned castle. In a storage room, Reiner gets suspicious that Ymir can read the label on a can of herring with a foreign language on it, but they are interrupted by a Titan ambush, with a beast Titan staring at them ominously. If we reflect on this scene for just a moment, it's kind of glaring that there was an action sequence here. Out of everywhere inside Wall Rose, the Titans just happened to stumble on the scouts? That seems like a huge coincidence, to the point of being a contrivance, as if they needed to just have an action scene. But, on my rewatch, that can of herring rang a bell in my head. The only way that could be there was if Marleyans were staying there. Oh gosh, Zeke was out doing operations in this area. Maybe that was Zeke's rations and he was using the castle as a hideout. So then, Zeke must have sicked the Titans upon them when he noticed the scouts. But wait, how the heck would Zeke have known that they were there in the first place? The scouts moved in under cover of night, and the Beast Titan is massive, so it's unlikely Zeke could have outscouted the scouts in Titan form. Zeke also couldn't have been spying in human form because we see him later in Titan form, and the flash of light from the transformation would have been too obvious. So, this could only be possible if Zeke had a stealthy scouting unit that noticed the scouts and alerted him. Oh, it's Peak. This only clicked for me when I watched the recent episode when Zeke reflected on Ragako and visually revealed Peak was there. It's not even the first time we learned the Cart Titan was used as a stealthy recon unit. So, to synthesize, Zeke and Peak had been exploring the territory and gassed Ragoko village to turn the people into Titans. The castle was a nearby, visible lodging, so it makes some sense that the scouts that investigated the village chose the same shelter as Zeke. Then, Peak noticed there were enemy troops at their base, so she notified Zeke to send the Titans in right around the time Ymir noticed the stash of food. In other words, it's not much of a coincidence at all once you understand the scattered clues and rationalize how each faction behaved. That's just the level of care Isayama put into weaving this plot. But there's even more narrative significance to this can. It's a big moment for Reiner, who becomes a temporary protagonist. Let's think about this scene from an attentive first-time viewer's perspective. Reiner looks terrified that he's in a room with a potential traitor who just let something slip. We empathize with Reiner the way that we might empathize with a good horror movie protagonist, and by pulling us to fear for him, it implicitly makes us trust him more. This segues into him fighting off the Titan in a moment of crisis, and I was especially rooting for him when he got his arm bit while trying to save Connie. He screams about wanting to go home and how he's not going to die here. It just makes him seem so heroic yet frail. I mentioned on my first half-hearted read-through that both the Annie and Reiner reveals caught me off guard. I think that if I was paying full attention, I might have caught the Annie reveal based just on visual similarity and process of elimination, but I'm not sure I would have seen the Reiner reveal because effective framing like this makes us trust him. We think we know him better than we actually do, perfectly analogous to how Eren felt betrayed. My invitation to you on your rewatch is to pay attention to moments like these where we see over Reiner's shoulder and how access to his thoughts or perspectives result in false trust being built. Also, note how different it looks the second time. On my rewatch, I realized that when he notices the can's foreign language, he's smart enough to play dumb and ask Ymir why she can read it when he, allegedly, cannot. In this moment, Reiner pieces out that she must have been from Marley and is likely thinking about how to question her to see if she was the one that ate Marcel, or what other useful information she might have. It's a moment straight out of Death Note. And, to cap it off, Reiner also sees the can as his first sign in years that reinforcements have arrived, and to start thinking about his rendezvous and escape strategy. After all, the whole point of Zeke's journey was to cause some chaos as a signal to get the warriors to regroup. This can is the beginning of Reiner's salvation, which is why he starts mentioning going home in the next scene, and only on rewatch do we realize this carries the implication of kidnapping Eren for Marley. In this moment, all these calculations are running in his head, and he's the biggest threat or the closest thing to a villain in that castle, but the can of herring managed to make us miss all that by framing it on Ymir. Pretty good narrative mileage for a can of fish, don't you think? World-building example. Pop quiz time. Here's a question about the Colossal Wall Titans. Which way are they facing? If you answer that they're facing inwards, congratulations, you're right. If you answer that they're facing outwards, congratulations, you're also right. Sort of. Let me explain what I mean. At the end of Season 1, we see a Colossal Titan's face poking out of the cracked walls. It's looking inward towards Stohess, and through various imagery on the island, it's presumed that all the walled Titans face inward. This meshes with the idea the scouts fight for freedom. If the walls are a prison, then the walled Titans are prison wardens, staring down at their inmates. But on repeat viewing, we notice in discussions and depictions off the island that the walled Titans are always portrayed as facing outwards. I don't think this is just an animation quirk. It's too consistent and makes perfect sense in terms of propaganda. Let's recall that King Fritz made a threat that the walled Titans would be used if Paradise was attacked. So, it's no surprise that the outside world's collective consciousness imagines the walled Titans gazing upon them as an everlasting threat. Even for the few who might have known otherwise, the concept of outwards-facing Titans ready to rumble at a moment's notice had too much value in keeping their populace in line and reminding them of the constant need for military dominance. As a potential sticking point, you might wonder why the Eldian restorationists also imagined the Titans as outward-facing when they more or less knew the king renounced war. But because they lived under Marleyan propaganda, they could only think of the founding Titans' military value and threat, rather than the prison nature of the island. Such is the power of propaganda, that it can influence internal mindsets, even among enemies of the state. Meanwhile, within the walls, a subset of people with an innate drive for freedom chose to interpret the walls as a challenge to their fundamental rights, and they ramped up their military so that they could survive in the outside world. Despite keeping the two groups apart for over a century, the walls provoked each of the groups by serving as a constant reminder of their foe and paved the path to conflict between these groups. If we examine the idea of mass destruction, the Colossal Titans can be interpreted as a symbol for the nuclear bomb, and the idea that their eyes always gaze at you is both a terrifying personification of the bomb as well as an examination of how nuclear deterrence endangers both enemies and the people it was supposed to protect. The careful depiction of their orientation is a detail I only recently noticed, but it has quickly become one of my favorite examples of subtle world building. My invitation to you on your rewatch is to think about how the meaning of the walls change throughout the show. We mentioned how early on the scouts interpret them as a prison, but they're not the only one with strong views on the walls. What are these clashing ideas, and how does it develop once the outside world is discovered? I'll cover this more in a future video, but as a hint, notice that the walls are all female. The next topic of discussion will be on the layered symbolism of the scouts and the scouts' feathered patch. Let's talk about a scene in episode 22. A quick summary to start off with. After the scouts were devastated by the female Titan, they take account of their casualties and recovered bodies. Levi kneels by a fellow soldier's corpse and appears to be checking their uniform. A scout named Dieter wants to retrieve his friend Ivan's corpse. However, Erwin and Levi forbid him from doing so because the risk was too great. Dieter cries and asks what is wrong with him. He decides to retrieve Ivan's body anyways, inadvertently luring all the Titans to chase the retreating scouts. He loses Ivan's corpse and gets another friend killed. Dieter himself nearly dies. An injured Levi commands the soldiers to dump the corpses to light the wagons, saying, "No corpse is special," only to see Petra's body fly off the wagon. Petra, as you recall, was one of his elite squad members who was among the first to develop mutual respect with Eren, going as far as to bite her hand in a show of solidarity. It was a tight-knit squad under Levi, with absolute trust, but because of Dieter, their bodies were lost. In the aftermath, Dieter cries as he expects Levi to reprimand or beat him. Instead, Levi just hands him a torn-off scout's patch, saying it was Ivan's and a reminder that he lived. Dieter cries in agreement. He clutches the patch on the way back to the wall. On my first time through, I thought this was a touching but typical scene for an action survival horror story. Petra got more screen time and screen presence than the other squad mates, so they decided to kick us in the gut by showing her body flying off. It makes sense. Having Levi show compassion to Dieter develops Levi beyond his cold exterior as well. It's good, but not spectacular. On my second time through, I realized something. There was a lie here. Did you catch it? Think about it. Dieter went to retrieve the body, accidentally lured the Titans, and lost Ivan's corpse. Levi was in the crowd of scouts with an injured ankle and never left his horse. There was never an opportunity for Levi to grab Ivan's patch, and they both know it. So, whose patch was it? It was Petra's. Recall the brief scene where we see Levi rummaging through the body bag, finding the patch belonging to a corpse with a bitten hand. That narrows it down to his squad, and considering he knew ahead of time where Petra's corpse was when it came time to dump them, and the focus on her from the camera, it's all but clear. Petra, who wanted to dedicate her life to serving Levi, who her dad thought she might have wanted to marry. We've never heard Levi say out loud how he felt about her. He's just not that kind of guy. But among the hundreds of corpses that weren't special, he did retrieve her patch. When a broken soldier was crying with regret and needed compassion, he gave him her patch and said it belonged to Ivan, proof that he lived. That was what Petra meant to him. On this rewatch, I thought this was genuinely great on multiple levels. This scene did more to characterize Levi for me than anything else in the early series, perhaps even as a little bit heroic. Furthermore, their mutual agreement to accept the lie as a coping mechanism spoke volumes about the Scouts' regiment, and not in a positive way. I thought about this in the context of Erwin's self-reflection, how he has molded the Scouts to be a legion of fools who rode to their deaths for the sake of those that came before, and with the promise that their deaths will be made meaningful by those that come after. This is no secret, as even Aaron knew this as a child. But I had always interpreted these lines as a never give up, generic, slightly edgy hero concept. But it was around the time of noticing this lie that I understood it to be much darker. Remembering Erwin's lines in Shinganshina, the heroic part was always a folly, and Levi was an unwitting conman. The lie gave Dieter something to cling onto when he had nothing, so that he could endure and give his life for the Scouts another day. Dieter's next appearance is in Season 3 as a corpse. In a cruel twist of irony, he is standing behind Petra looking upon Erwin, wondering what became of their sacrifice. It was this patch and lie that led him there. So let me ask you this. What do the Scout wings symbolize? Oh, they say it so often, the wings of freedom. Any idiot could tell you that, right? But when Levi is handing that patch to Dieter, and they both agree that it's Ivan's, how does this patch and lie represent freedom? It doesn't. Just as Levi lied about who the patch belonged to, the meaning of the wings of freedom is analogously bastardized. What's happening here is that Dieter is broken and remorseful, so Levi, with limited options, chose to tell this lie to show solidarity and get him to endure. Although Levi is doing it out of compassion, he is playing right into the idea of the Scout cycle of death, and this lie and belief in the Scout symbol is what allows Dieter to continue fighting and enduring until he himself dies. The truth is long gone. All that remains is solidarity and desperate belief in the institution of the Scouts, which Erwin admits has always been a con to get believers to throw their lives away. The symbol keeps them in line, keeps them believing that they, or their deaths, can be useful. So what does it mean now? I argue the symbol is bastardized in certain circumstances. What once was freedom has changed to become a self-referential symbol of the Scouts, and is used to remind them to endure and the usefulness of their deaths. I'm about to make a comparison that is sensitive, and requires a disclaimer that it is not a one-to-one copy of history. In the context of the series' examination of fascism, the Scouts' wings are the closest thing this series has to a swastika. It develops into a flagship fascist symbol of militancy to inspire soldiers to give their lives to a cause greater than themselves, and though Levi may be doing this out of earnest compassion, there's no escaping the undercurrent of complicity. To be clear, I don't think this series is an endorsement of these symbols or ideologies, rather an examination and cautionary tale, and this vignette about Petra's feathered patch is a meaningful examination of the way they lie to themselves, to maintain resolve while inadvertently priming the powder keg that is the Scouts' regiment. This vignette about Levi and Dieter is one of the larger deltas between my viewing experiences. It also happens to be an anime-exclusive scene. I include it anyways because it so deftly synthesizes many of the series' most impactful themes. I will be breaking it down more thoroughly in another video because this was only a quick snippet. There is more to the scene and more arguments to be made. In the meantime, my invitation to you and your rewatch is to pay attention to the way the Scouts' wings are used throughout the series. Pay attention to the duality. When do the Scouts represent freedom, and when does it represent something decidedly more disturbing? How does this progress? What helped allow the Jaegerists to form? I'll admit this was the stuff that caught my attention and got me pumped on my first viewing. This stuff is just so easy to latch onto and miss warnings in the story, at least before the Marley arc. I find it disturbing that I took it at face value on my first watch through, and I'm willing to bet at least a few other people did too. And I think this runs a provocative parallel to how many characters in the story are also blind to its consequences until it is too late. There's a lot I want to say on Attack on Titan, because I've not really seen anyone else talk about this show and manga in ways that express what I felt about it. And yeah, I could gush for hours talking about every little nugget that I caught on rewatch with my friends, or how much I appreciate certain characters upon understanding the direction of their larger arcs, but I think what makes Attack on Titan hit so hard the second time for me is that it matched the moment. I thought it was some simple zombie show half a decade ago, but by present day, having just experienced the craziest several years in modern history, witnessing the rise of nationalism at home and abroad, and seeing a massive pipeline to extremism nearly cripple the institutions so many of us took for granted, the themes in this work of fiction feel so much more pertinent. Of course, I'm not saying the events depicted are intended to be anything close to a one-to-one mapping, but maybe the last reason you should watch it again is because the examination of propaganda and nationalism are important lessons that we still need to learn.